Okay. All right. Well, thanks everyone for joining. I really appreciate it. My name is Nathan Hurdle, for those of you that don't know me, and I've invited Paul Kazyak here to give the seminar today, a little bit less on the science heavy side and more on the science policy pipeline. I figured that'd be interesting to a lot of folks. I'll give a brief background on Paul, emphasis brief because his CV is extensive and we'd be here until 12:30 just going through it. And so this is Paul Kazyak, and he's someone I consider to be a true leader in the field of environmental science and policy. So Paul earned his BS from Cornell before going on to SUNY ESF to get a master's in environmental biology, after which he went on to work for the Maryland Department of Natural Resources for over 20 years, where, among a lot of other things, he oversaw water quality monitoring for the Chesapeake and Coastal Bays Trust Foundation, and also he designed the nationally renowned Maryland Biological Stream Survey. And Paul has also been really a driving force in sustainability education, not just in Maryland. He currently teaches courses on applied sustainability at Johns Hopkins, and he also has mentored high school and college students in environmental leadership. Paul was, I say was because I don't know the status anymore, Paul was an advisor for Boy Scout Venturing Crew 202, a group which I am a proud alum, and has planted more than 40,000 large trees, assisted DNR with their scientific surveys, and doing thousands of hours of public outreach. Paul has won numerous awards for environmental leadership and activism, and I would almost certainly not be here today without his mentorship and without, sort of his passion for environmental education and caring for the climate. So I'm pleased to introduce Paul Kazyak, and he'll be talking about the use of science in decision-making, some reflections.
All right. Well, thanks, Nathan. You said probably too much. Anyway, welcome all of you. And it would be nice if I could be there in person, but I try to be mindful of carbon footprints and all that. So we'll do it by Zoom. Happy to take questions and stay as long as you want after to talk about things. But when Nathan asked me to talk, I thought that maybe a little bit of a reflection on mostly from my standpoint of working in a state agency, what might be useful to you. And, one of the questions I want to kind of leave you with is whether we're doing enough as scientists in today's world. So, I was hired in 1993 at Maryland DNR to run the statewide stream survey, which was starting up. And I had previously written the sampling manual for it when I was a consultant to DNR's power plant research program. And I wanted to just thank all the folks that were part of the survey. And I brag about them as probably for a 10-year period being the best state agency group of biologists, scientists ever in the history of whatever. And it's the survey goes on today, so 30 years and running, and something more than 75 referee journal articles have come from the survey. And if you know about state agencies, this is not a place where you do referee journal publications. So we took that pretty seriously. And reflecting on it, I actually doubt that these publications had much influence on management decisions, but they certainly garnered respect in the scientific community for us. And just to give you an idea, since you're probably mostly marine folks, our survey is in streams and small rivers, and every place we sampled, we would do water chemistry and physical habitat and biology, and the biology would include fish, benthic macroinvertebrates, herpetofauna, crayfish, invasive riparian plants, so lots of things. Also stuff like continuous temperature logging. And then afterward, we would digitize every catchment to really take a hard look at land use and impervious service. So a ton of stuff to collect. And one of my reflections over the years was when we started, it was everyone except me probably was a contractual employee, which is a horrible way that science is done today. You don't get benefits, don't get vacation. And so what we could offer was specialty areas, to crayfish specialists and data management and GIS specialists and all that. So we kind of developed our individual specialties, and that was the best thing we could offer. And it worked really well. So one of the things that I had an assumption with, and I'm sure that this might be yours as well, is that good science leads to good management decisions. And I kind of learned over the years that maybe it needs to be a little bit more than that. I'm not saying you don't need good science, so don't have that as a takeaway. But one of my first experiences in state government was I noticed that there were ChemLawn signs outside the state office building. And if you know much about Chesapeake Bay, we're all about trying to reduce nutrients. And here we were at the headquarters applying useless nutrients, and the lawn actually looked worse than mine. And Nathan can tell you that my lawn is terrible. It's probably no grass. But anyway, so getting to even get that changed was problematic. So my first few days was like, so we don't use science here. It was a little bit of a wake-up call. And Nathan didn't mention, but before I went to college, I was actually in the Navy for 6 years, and I did nuclear engineering on submarines. And one of the things that most of the time I didn't cherish that time at all. I wanted to get out badly to start my life. But I did pick up the importance of quality assurance, because in submarines, it's life or death. And when you're hundreds of feet underwater. So I brought that with me to the table, and I pushed to include quality assurance throughout the stream survey. And one of those things you can see on the slide, training and testing of biologists. Mostly in academia, we assume that people know what they're identifying and that sort of thing, and that the data is correct. It's not always, I can tell you that. We'll go through a little bit of that afterward. And I should also give you a little background on where the money came from, because this was a unique situation for Maryland. They have an environmental trust fund, so something like 6 or 8 cents on every utility bill, every house, every month goes to look at the environmental impacts of energy generation. And in our case, the state was interested in the impacts of acid deposition, so acid rain, on streams. And this particular graphic shows you the streams that are sensitive to becoming acidified in red, and it also gives you an idea of the sampling density. So we're talking about a ton of sites. I think we're probably over 8,000 sites in 30 years. So it's very data rich kind of data set. And, this survey is probability based. So randomly selected sites within a nested thing I won't go into today. But anyway, this was new. And this goes back so far that GPS was just being released to the public. It was being used in the military. So the first devices were clunky, and many people didn't even think that you could use GPS to go find a randomly selected site. But somehow, I guess we made it work, and now it's routine. But that's how far back this goes. Another thing is, I have to relate that I don't even think the survey would have lasted had I not had the experience that I did before coming to DNR. I had worked with our natural heritage program, and they do rare species, and also our fisheries program as a consultant for DNR. So I came in with a good reputation. And those two units, I don't know if it's better today, but back then they were at each other all the time, because fisheries would stock trout in a stream that might have rare plants in it, and then anglers would crumple the plants, and it was just bad blood. And so I can remember literally mitigating arguments while they were meeting to talk about our survey. They were bitching at each other. So that was kind of interesting, and I'm pretty sure that either side would have shut me down if they didn't have confidence. So it's sometimes the stars have to align for things to work. And just to give you an idea, this is probably 5,000 sites or so from the earlier, I don't know, 10 years ago or so. Now the map is much more filled in. And you think about what could you do with a data set that is that rich? Where are you going, and what could you quantify that would be of use for management? So that was one thing that kept us, we were always on the lookout for what can we do with this really unique situation? And it really is a cool data set. Why are we not moving forward here? There. Okay. No single monitoring program can answer all the questions, but we were interested in what could we answer. So clearly we recognized this should be a long-term monitoring program. So that's what we went into it with. And knowing as a consultant, you kind of have to be a jack of all trades a lot of times. So I knew that water quality regulation could be an important part of the survey, but I was also very interested in what living resource data could we collect as well, especially when it's quantitative at a statewide scale. One of the things I learned, talk about how you're going to use science in management. When we asked folks that were managing aquatics generally, what things they needed answers to, it was basically crickets. People couldn't come up with things, and that kind of astounded me. But I know that it's probably just human nature, and I would have approached the problem differently and probably try to get a bunch of people together in a collaborative setting instead of just sending out a questionnaire, because it just kind of got blank looks where people were on a screen. But I think in the same room that may have led to better questions and all that. But we went ahead with what we thought we could do. And one of the rules that I set running the program was we always had to have all of the data analysis done before you started sampling the next year. Because if you don't, you end up with this horrible backlog. And if you're, delayed by 3 to 5 years, which EPA almost routinely is with their sampling and everything, the data is not very useful. So that was something that we stuck to, and it, costs a lot of extra hours working, but we did manage to do it, at least while I was still in charge. And another thing that I'll say is that we willingly share data with our partners, including counties and EPA and stuff. And I would say that was a huge plus in building relationships. And I know in academia, you want to protect the data so that you can publish and get credit for it. But I would encourage you to think about what's the broader use of this. And if I share, I might lose some of the credit, but does it, are we able to make better management decisions with that? So, yeah. So anyway, lots of questions. The other thing I learned is before we ever published our first quality assurance report, and we did that basically every year, and it was kind of like hanging out your dirty laundry. So I ended up being the quality assurance officer as well as the person running the program. But you go in the field and you see that, there was a big tear in the block net, so the fish could have gotten by, and you write it down and it shows up in the report. And the crew leaders don't like that, right? Because you're kind of throwing their dirty laundry. But I'll tell you what, it makes people do better. And there's no program, as you go through your career, you'll see there's no program that's perfect. So quality assurance is important so that you can have data of known and acceptable quality. But what I learned was all you have to do is talk about quality assurance, and people think that you're like the best thing, ever. And there was no proof in the pudding. So that's interesting. And I should relay a similar story. During COVID, I did a fairly large consulting job helping to evaluate a foundation-funded environmental monitoring and restoration program. This is, they had invested over $100 million. They wanted to see what was right with the program, what was wrong. And in reviewing the monitoring part of the program, I found huge inconsistencies in quality assurance. And none of the participants ever questioned, not even for a second, anything that I wrote. One of the academics involved, and I can't tell you the group, but they complained that they had articles published and accepted, referee journal articles based on the data collection that was used. So why was it that I was questioning it? And so people don't like to have their dirty laundry looked at and brought out in public. So my advice to you is make sure you're doing really good quality assurance stuff as you go on. Anyway, lessons learned. So one of the first things we did, we wanted to characterize stream health across the state. And this is what a picture of that looked like. And you see a lot of red. Turned out that more than half of the sites were impaired or in poor biological condition. This is using bugs, benthic macroinvertebrates, and fish. So that's, we had to have indicators for that. So I wanted to relay a little story about indicators. There's a little bit of in coastal work, index of biotic integrity. So it's a multi-metric index kind of thing. In freshwater streams, it would be what is the proportion of things that are sensitive to pollution? What is their feeding strategy? Are they generalists? Are they invertivores or whatever? And so we published this and then we used it. And it was kind of against, you'll see my name is in the list of authors there, but I had a big problem with it. And two big problems. One is, if you look at all the small streams in Maryland, at one time they would all have been cold water streams and had brook trout. And as you develop the land and convert forest to agriculture and all that, the streams warmed and the brook trout would go away and then other species would be there. With climate change, the streams that are still cold water are becoming warm water, and that's happening at a rapid pace. So what you have is a bunch of minnow species, cyprinids, that can now breed because it's warm enough in the summer. So you get more species richness. It inflates the IBI score from a degradation. And that's a big problem if you think about climate change. So you're gauging stream health, but it's going the wrong way. And a similar thing we found with eels, American eels. If you know much about American eels, they're down at least 90%, probably more than that from historical abundance. And they live in freshwater streams for most of their lives till they're adults. Then they migrate back to the Sargasso Sea and mate. But anyway, when they have access to streams, they're efficient predators on things like sculpins. That's a Blue Ridge sculpin on the picture there. That's a sedentary fish, sits on the bottom kind of like a tadpole. And what you see is when you have eels that that can get up into the streams because they're not blocked by dams, you have way fewer sculpins. The reverse is true when you have dams. So where Nathan and I lived, we have Liberty Dam. It's on the Patapsco River, which drains to Baltimore. It's an impassable barrier for eels. Above that, the scores, IBI scores, are much higher than they would be otherwise because you have a fish that's sensitive to pollution and an invertivore. So it gets higher multimetric scores and basically skews the thing in a way that's not real. So one of the things that I thought and still think was a better approach, now this is going against established science, but observe versus expected. Just simply what would you expect there and then what is there? And it's just a proportion. I think that would be a better indicator. But the science had already moved on. The states were using the multimetric version. And so sometimes so now you got to caveat everything for the rest of your life about why the scores are higher than they should be or whatever. And I think it confuses things. So I think science went in the wrong direction there for management. That's my opinion. Again, this is all my opinion. I'm retired. I can say whatever I want. But anyway, another piece of advice is with our survey, probability-based sampling was new, right? And if you do the marine environment, it's been going on for a long time. But anyway, a lot of skepticism, and some people just ignored it and so forth. But it took some reading to really get a grasp on it. And we had a unit director that was really willing and able to digest all this information. And what you find as you go through life is most people don't read whole articles, whole publications and everything. You skim at best. Some people don't read anything. So having somebody in authority who is willing to do that work is really important when you need changes in your survey design. You don't have enough money to do something. So I would say that having somebody in that decision tree that understands what you're doing is really important. So it's more than just coming up with the digestible stuff that's for the managers, but it's somewhere in between. People need to understand the science that's going on. So that fellow was pretty important to our success. And you could see his glasses protector there. It's a good sign that you're talking to a nerd that might read your papers. So our sister agency, Maryland Department of the Environment, does all of the water quality regulation air too. But so Maryland DNR didn't do that, but we realized this information really should be used for that purpose. So this is one of the early maps of impaired watersheds. And basically, you can see the state of Maryland is biologically impaired. And this is with a very generous ruler, if you will, a yardstick that is not pre-Columbian at all. It's the best of what's left, and then comparing that to what the conditions are. So when things are impaired, if you're familiar with the Clean Water Act, then states are required to do a thing called a total maximum daily load, and you see that widely used now. And what happened with the listing of all these watersheds is our Department of the Environment spent $3 or $4 million, I think, writing TMDLs. And you want science to be used, and we were happy about that. When you start to see the products, we had a watershed in far western Maryland, so probably 180 miles upstream from the head of tide. There was a section about tidal stuff. So you kind of get an idea that this is the final product, that people aren't even reading them. So that was a little disappointing. And, that there'd be things like, well, you can't address legacy effects. So all of the deforestation and siltation that occurred from that never is going to get fixed. There's not even an intent to do that. So when you're a biologist and you see that maybe isn't the right approach, it's very frustrating. So again, the science maybe not being used in management, kind of pseudo used, but not effectively. Another thing that we found out is if you don't have people interested in your information before you start the study, it's actually kind of hard to get them to buy in. And it took a while. So we had some difficulty, and again, the managers we were after, they couldn't come up with management questions of interest even. So that was really interesting. And so you end up like thinking, oh, our reports are going to be used in the outhouse. That one there was called From the Mountains to the Sea, and we made like 20,000 copies and did a big press release and everything. This is Governor Martin O'Malley, and he was the governor then. And this is a case where just a press release caused money to be spent. And so the governor apparently asked his staff, well, so what does this report say? And basically the bottom line was things are in pretty bad condition. So he felt like doing a press release, he had to announce some money. So he basically stole $6 million from state highways and threw it in DNR's budget. So that's one thing that I could say that came out of the survey. It's pretty funny. Anyway, and then you remember that Godzilla and King Kong thing, this big fight between Natural Heritage Program and Fisheries. Well, they weren't totally happy with us either. The person that did freshwater mussels was very concerned that we would kill all the rare mussels. And so that was something we had to work through. And if you don't sample those kinds of streams, they tend to be better quality ones. So you're going to bias your statewide estimates. So we got around that initially by taking that biologist out with us whenever we sampled. But then we took steps to really increase our training to the point that we produced a taxonomic key for mussels and became now known as the freshwater mussel experts and do a lot of specific mussel work. So just disarming somebody's concerns by becoming good at what that was and satisfying all their, more than satisfying. So fast forward from when they didn't want us to sample, 3 or 4 years later, they were actually paying us to sample and share the data. And our relationship got so good that you may not be familiar with, but all the states do a state wildlife action plan, and it would in New York would include marine mammals, probably listed as species of greatest conservation need. So I ended up writing with folks in my group pretty much the aquatic section of that state wildlife plan, and we didn't get paid for it, but it was because we had the most of the data, and had by then really a reputation for I guess excellence. I don't know. Then we started being asked to be on environmental reviews for rare species and all that. So it's kind of, I would say that our expertise did get used for management, in all these smaller scale ways as a result of the survey. So within 10 years, more than half of the rare species database for aquatic species were from our statewide stream survey. So that was pretty cool. We were just opening new doors and all that. And it was really fun. And one of the things that I think this program is a great example of is having new science that excites the folks doing the work. So if any of you have ever been in a situation where you're kind of in flow when you're working, it doesn't seem like work anymore. We had that for like 10 years. I mean, people were really just gung-ho about doing it and, kind of really making a difference. So one of the things we did was to help our natural heritage program folks, we came up with greatest conservation need strongholds, and then these critical reaches where the species were found. We didn't ever say what those species were. This was more for counties, for their development and so forth, to look at where, could they develop in areas that were of less importance from a biodiversity standpoint. And then another thing we did, because our data was quantitative, we could use kriging to really map out where densities were highest. And this is an American brook lamprey, which is pretty rare in Maryland. It's only in the area around DC. And that was used a number of times to modify developments or even stop them. So that was pretty cool. And then back to our sister agency, Department of the Environment. It took a while, but eventually they wanted to use the data for outstanding waters designation, tier 2 streams and so forth, if you have any familiarity with that. And then also to help diagnose their 303D listed impaired waters. What things do you need to fix? And we also used a volunteer benthic monitoring program that we ran as a companion to the statewide stream survey called Stream Waders. And that thing has probably 10 or 12,000 sites now. Just bugs, it's the only thing they sample. But if you're only going to sample one thing in freshwater streams, benthic microinvertebrates are the best. So yeah. So that would be impaired, and then outstanding waters. And then we collected data on invasive plants next to streams and riparian areas. So that's, again, a kriging kind of thing. And you could see they're pretty much everywhere. The area around DC is the most. But what you could see from various statewide rounds was the spread of invasive species. And it's really sobering. Of course, in marine waters, it's, the water's all connected. So if the habitat works, they'll spread there. And I just mentioned 2 summers ago, I went to Martha's Vineyard for a week, and the number of blue crabs up there was astounding. So the temperature changes are definitely causing species shifts. And of course, that happens in the terrestrial environment as well. So one of the things we were probably most concerned about was development, right? Urbanization. And so we put a fair amount of effort into that. And we also tried to educate our local county folks, because that's, counties are where the development hits, rubber hits the road, if you will. And you all know this, there's no secret, but even 25 years ago, mistrust of state government was high because Maryland is a blue state, but most of the counties are red. And so the elected officials tend to be conservative and not so environmentally oriented. One of the things we did was we invited those elected officials to go out with, whoever the watershed group person was from the county, and in a, kind of informal atmosphere, go look at the resources, go do some electrofishing and all that. And that had some effect. And also talking with landowners, one of my crew leaders talking with the guy in the blue shirt there, it was also quite useful, and sometimes really changes people's minds. But I'll say that this is one of our most conservative counties, Allegany County in Western Maryland. And what you see here is a map of the county that shows the watersheds ranked across the state, and then had the streams that were had particularly high biodiversity or rare species. I maybe a little bit of impact on where they develop it, but I would say mostly ignored. So that was, good science not being used. And I always look at it as we didn't use the right approach. There's got to be some other way. So, don't think that, oh, we couldn't get through to them. That's on you. You own part of the mess. If you're the scientist, you got to figure out how to get the word across and make the decision plainly obvious. All right. Another thing that we wanted to do is predict, what's going to happen if you do more development or whatever. So we put a fair amount of time into that. Number of master's theses and so forth came out of it. And I'll just show you one graphic. So brook trout don't like pavement, road runoff, and all it brings could be salt, could be sediment, could be high flows. It could be a temperature shock during a summer thunderstorm. A bunch of things contribute to that. But at any rate, they're very sensitive to impervious. And if you tease this graph out, you can see even at a 0.5% impervious in the watershed, you see pretty steep declines in brook trout, and ultimately they go away. The ones where 3 to 5% impervious, those don't exist anymore because they were on their way out. They just happened to be still there when we sampled. So we try to use things like that to incorporate into management decisions. And so what we have here is the Chesapeake Bay Agreement, which some of you may be aware of. The first one was in 1987. They got longer and longer. But one thing I would say is none of the Bay Agreements included mention of imperviousness thresholds. Even though the data was solidly there were discussions about it, but the counties just wouldn't go for any kind of restriction like that. But you do see, like, by December 21, they revised the date, by the way, pushed it back 5 years. Look at measure the extent and rate of change in impervious surface coverage. So it's kind of throwing you a bone that your science was important, but we had the threshold stuff, but it didn't get used. And then the next one, restore 900 miles per year of riparian forest. That's all great until at least 70% of riparian areas throughout the watershed are forested. We have information that shows it's not just the riparian area that affects water quality and biological quality. It's really the whole area, and certainly leaving 30% of the riparian area not buffered is a really substantial impact. So if you're trying to restore Chesapeake Bay, that won't do it. We have the science to show that won't do it. So anyway, it's politics and all that. And then the last one is restore and sustain brook trout. And they wanted an 8% increase in occupied habitat. The reality is we've probably lost 16% since that document was written. There was no way with climate change that was ever going to work. And, again, we had the information, made the case, but politicians being what they are, including within natural resources management, threw that in there. And so nobody agreed with it on the ground. But then we're getting through this pretty good. There's the thing called a rain tax. All right. It was House Bill 987, and Martin O'Malley was governor in 2012, and he got it pushed through. And the idea was all this imperviousness is causing degradation, and you need to kind of own your piece of the mess and have it sink into the ground rather than just run off directly into streams and rivers. One of the aspects of the bill is that homeowners were going to be required to participate, and nonprofits like churches were not exempt. All right. So what happened was the Republican Party reframed it as the rain tax, right? They're taxing the rain. Isn't that just horrible? And Larry Hogan made it the centerpiece of the campaign. He was our most recent governor. It was the centerpiece of his campaign. We have to get rid of this rain tax. This is so stupid. So in 2015, when he took office, they repealed it. And it's based on good science. And to me, it's a great example of if you don't prime and frame the issues, all the best data in the world can be just negated. And in my mind, that's exactly what happened. So as you go through your careers and you're producing information that is going to be used for management, framing and priming are really, really important. I used to think that, just good science, you're going to have good decisions. I do not think that anymore. I think you need more. Okay, just a few review lessons here. Framing, again, priming, you have to have that, and thinking about what study would make this decision so obvious that, it would be done. For some of you in marine mammals, like the noise thing, what would make it so obvious? Got to think about that. And sometimes you think it is, but maybe it's not resonating. Another thing I think is really important is the interconnectedness of problems. And we tend to be siloed. We're mechanistic and reductionist in our approach to science. All of us have little specialty areas, and we don't do enough looking at the problem at a bigger scale. So, for instance, an example would be Chesapeake Bay. We want to reduce nitrogen and phosphorus by 40%. That'll make everything better. But we don't look at the broader problem of why industrial agriculture has become dominant and what the social, economic, and cultural aspects are from that, because they're all interrelated. And if you don't look at a problem that way, you end up saying, well, what we need to do is spend $25 million a year on cover crops. We're not going to change this industrial system. So I would argue that we haven't looked at the problem in a holistic enough fashion. And then I stressed this before, you can read this. I made it up to be funny at a conference a few years ago, but you got to be timely with your stuff. You can't sit on information. And if it means you have to cut back the size of the study, you still need to be timely. And then once again, to reinforce that you got to lead people down the decision-making road with the science. If we're not using terms people can understand or having the length be the right amount, that's a problem. And you shouldn't expect to have success if you're trying to do that. And this is a quote that's attributed to a few people: "Be brief, be brilliant, be gone." So you got to know your audience. These folks don't want to read a tome. There's only a few people who will do that. It has to be the condensed version, but you also have the science. You need to have the science to back it up. So you do need that longer version. And so another thing I threw in here is don't do bad science. And I think sometimes we will accept money and do things that won't, might skew things or whatever. So the premise of doing good science, hypothesis testing, it remains really important in the world. And so, many of you're in grad school now, some of you will end up in consultant world, and you may work for the quote bad guys, industry or whatever. And you may be pressured to do things that aren't, necessarily great science. So I would encourage you to resist that. Another thing, this is particularly a problem, I think, with Chesapeake Bay. Don't sugarcoat. Don't put lipstick on a pig. If we're not making progress, we need to be maybe not as optimistic and be willing to try different things. So I think being honest is important, and that's an important thing. So why is all of what I just said important? So I just want to go over a few things, what we know, just to remind you. All right. Human biomass is at least an order of magnitude higher than all the wild animals combined. And if you add pets and livestock, it's like 96% to 4%. And that it shows we're totally dominant in the world. We shouldn't expect to have stable ecosystems and stable food sources and so forth when we're at that level. And then, of course, you're all familiar with the species extinction rate. 1 million of maybe 8 million are already facing extinction in the next few decades, and the rate is increasing sharply. We're just starting to bring in the climate part of things. So that's not good. Trends are really bad. There's some hopefulness in some areas, but overall, this is not a good place to be. And then in the marine environment, we're using more and more of the primary productivity in the ocean for our own use. So we shouldn't expect to have stable ecosystems if we're not managing for them. So, at one time when I was younger, people thought the fisheries were inexhaustible in the ocean. We know that that's by far not the case now. When you look at plastics, all the microplastics in the water and what the projections are for, time frame for having more zooplankton-sized plastics in the water than zooplankton, not a good thing, right? And then, of course, noise with, marine mammals and so forth. Just tremendous number of things. And dead zones, 400 plus major dead zones in the world. Chesapeake Bay is one of those. And this is a situation where we've put a lot of effort into trying to fix this problem, including billions of dollars spent. And in last year, we ended up punting and okay, we need to reset everything and try again. So we're actually not making progress. And again, I would say that we haven't looked at the problem in holistic enough fashion. And what we found is things like chicken production has more than doubled in Chesapeake Bay watershed since 1987, when we committed to reduce things. So you have more nutrients imported into the watershed. Now we bring in corn and soy from outside to feed the chickens. And of course, the chicken poop is something you need to deal with. And then the only reason that it hasn't gotten much worse is we're converting agricultural land to housing, which has its own set of bad problems. So that's the only reason that ag contributions have stayed at the 1987 level. So these are serious problems. And again, Chesapeake Bay, the effort is held up worldwide as this great ecosystem management thing. But I'm arguing here that we haven't been holistic enough. That farmers aren't particularly happy doing industrial agriculture. And it hurts your head when you try to think about I only do, I'm a water quality person or whatever. How do I interact with that other thing? I think it just points to the need to include social sciences and just a whole bunch more things to fix these problems, which are really wicked problems, if you're familiar with that term. So, and then, of course, climate change, the greenhouse gases going up. And the first semester I had when I got out of the Navy, I had a world conservation class, and the fellow there was friends with one of the people that started this monitoring at Mauna Loa. And he was very clear back in 1982 that climate change is going to be a big problem. And so it's made sense to me. Everything that's gone along over time has, was laid out to me when I was in my first semester, and it's not been wrong. So if anything, it's been underestimated. So I think the picture is very clear now. We're just mismanaging things to the point that we're at risk, right? And I, as now a retired person, but even throughout my career, that's not acceptable to me. And so what I think we need to do as scientists is, okay, how do we own our part of the mess? Have we played a role in this? And I would suggest maybe we just need to think about that and how, okay, what do we do differently going forward? So I'll give you an example. One thing is we know from social science work is just educating people about a problem doesn't change what they do, doesn't cause them to do behavior change. And so if we're just putting out reports, which I did a whole lot of in my career, I have the bookshelf behind me is stacked with garbage I probably should just burn now, but anyway, a lot of science in there. But do we need to do something more, something different? So that's kind of, I guess, why I agreed to talk with you today, but just to think about, okay, what is it? And then I think about this a lot. If we know that we're on a path that humans will become extinct, very likely, is it, do we have to kind of do something different? Just to leave you with that, and I'll stop sharing and would love to take some questions and have you poke fun or holes at my argument.
Thanks, Paul. Do we have any questions? Oh, I'll read this one from the audience. Anthony asks, can you repeat what the rain tax fully was? They didn't quite get exactly what it was.
Okay, so it was a stormwater management thing that basically said if you have impervious surface that's contributing to direct runoff, then you had to control it. And the Republicans used the argument, primarily homeowners too, but the churches, they're going to put the churches out of business because they're going to have to do this. And one county, Prince George's County, which is next to DC, had a program where they were going to subsidize, most or all of it for the nonprofits. So I think it would have been worked through. But again, the framing is really important. Thanks for that question, though.
That's just to reiterate, because it's been a while since I thought about it. It's something like you would have to pay an amount that's proportional to the amount of impervious surface on your land, correct?
Right.
Okay, cool.
Yep, that is correct.
Any other questions? You can just raise your hand from the chat.
So this is Anthony again. So just to make sure, like, basically, if you had like a surface of water running along, like you're running along like near your house, you would have to you were forced, the Republicans forced you to like pay for it.
It wasn't that specific. It was more like if you digitize and you could see, it was based on the square footage, I think, of imperviousness.
All right, thanks.
Yeah.
Any other questions from the audience? You can raise your hand or just speak up.
Yeah.
Okay. If not, I have one, and it's not that different than what I asked you last time we spoke, Paul. And really, it's sometimes when we see this stuff, I get depressed thinking about the reality of it, right? We have sort of the shifting baseline. It's like, what's the point of restoring brook trout habitat if it doesn't matter? The average temperature in Maryland is going to make it impossible for there to be brook trout in 20 years. So how do you grapple with the fact that there's always going to be people that say, what's the point? And they might even be right. What's sort of your mental exercise in working through that?
Yeah, so I've come to a lot of different thoughts over the years. One thing is these problems are all connected. They're not just separate things. It's just the way we live. And so we have to change that. If we can start to address this at that higher level, then we got a chance. And then for more pragmatic, say you worked in natural heritage program, and you were looking at coastal areas, which, in Chesapeake Bay, we have like twice the sea level rise because of the rebound or sinking effect from glaciers. And so by 2050, we'll have 3 more feet of sea level than we do now. So a lot of the low-lying streams with freshwater fish that are rare, there's nothing you could do with that. So I think you just have to be pragmatic and stop trying to manage for those. with loss of brook trout. You still want the water quality to be as good as it can be. And I think that's just that's a grieving that we're going to have to go through. That being said, my grandchildren and their grandchildren and your great-grandchildren are all going to still have a world to live in. And I think we owe it to them to make it, we can't leave it better than we came into it, right? That's beyond the possibility, but let's at least set it on the right track so it's not unlivable. And so that's kind of what drives me. Yeah.
Well said. Thank you for that. So I have a question from Matt. He asks, what are your thoughts on how agriculture can help reduce their impacts to these watersheds? Will it be through future regulations, or are there other more general solutions?
Great. So in Chesapeake Bay, folks have shied away from regulation because of the power of the lobby. So I think, we can't just think, oh, it's got to be a government policy change or, by regulation. Maybe it's incentivizing sustainable agriculture, making it really attractive. And maybe it's working on demands of, I hate to use the word consumers, but people that eat food. If we can change their diet and what they think is important in terms of purchasing food. And a great example is the growth of organic food, right? That's exponentially growing still. So can we do that? Can we also then bring in things like controlled environment agriculture, where you can fairly easily grow 10 times more pounds per acre, and then get rid of, say, 70% of the ag land and make it forest again? That would be pretty cool. Then you can really start to have benefits to water quality that would be reflected in coastal areas and, and all that. So I think we just need to think differently. Just have to be very creative. What works? China is a great example where their controlled environment agriculture, it grows by 15% a year. That's an extraordinary growth rate. It's been sustained for a long time. So we can do these things. And you have to have hope. That's, I guess, is the other thing, is you can't lose hope.
Matt says, thank you.
Yep.
Any other questions? Going once.
I have one.
Yeah, go for it, Anthony.
So I know you were talking about you're trying to save fishes, I believe. I don't exactly know what it was, but so do you think that the pollution that a lot of people are throwing, or do you think we should, wait, I need to word this right, sorry.
Right.
do you think we'll be able to help more of these fishes, with more laws, trying to deal with pollution, a more steadfast law?
So I think the idea, the concept of total maximum daily load, was well intended, but with the number of chemicals that we have out there, we're always finding new things. And if you think about PFAS, now we're learning how much more deadly they are, and to human health and so forth. They're just not good things. And we didn't know that when they were made. So I think the precautionary principle is probably the better way to go. How do we get people to demand things that are not as, not as toxic? Just demand that right off the bat. And if you think about how humanity has lived for most of our existence, we've been pretty easy on the environment. We're not, we didn't leave all these legacy things. We can change. We can still have modern conveniences, but maybe at a little bit lesser scale, and be quite happy. So I think it's more of a transformational thing. Can I live differently? And then you're kind of attacking all the problems at once. You don't have to try and rank which is worse. Is it sea level rise, or is it PCBs, or is it sediment? You're actually trying to go after it all at once by changing the way we live.
All right, thank you.
Sure.
Any final questions? We have roughly until 1, so we can sort of
Yeah.
amble towards the end of our time.
Yeah, I hope you all find this useful in some ways. Just again, kind of a experience that I had over the years and frustrations and all that. We had some successes as well, but if you look at the overall thing in Maryland from 1972 to 2000, 27% of the state got developed. That is not sustainable, not in any way, shape, or form, and is Nathan, I'm sure when you come home, you see new development all the time, and it's not
every time. Yep.
Yep.
So we have a question from Julia. What would you recommend to research scientists who want to pivot more to the policy-making side of science? Strictly government, or can industry be a good pivot point as well?
Oh, that's a great question. I have a friend who I'm a coach for at the National Conservation Leadership Institute, and he works for Weyerhaeuser, and they have, I forget how many million acres. It's a big number across the country, and he is very deep into trying to change the culture of Weyerhaeuser for biodiversity gain and so forth. And he says half the time he hates his job because it's very frustrating, but I suspect that he may have more influence on ultimately what their policy is than anybody in government could. And that's a big, forestry is a huge thing. So I think it could happen either way. You just need to be a little bit careful about industry, where the profit motive is the foremost thing. And you see that I'm sure you're all familiar with ESG, the governance stuff, and some companies are very sincere about it, some are not. So I would try to hook up with a company that is sincere and wanting to do the right things. It gives you a much better shot. Yeah, hope that helps.
She says, awesome, thank you.
Yeah.
I think we have time for one more question. Any last thoughts? No. All right. Well, thank you everyone for coming. I really appreciate it. And Paul, thank you so much for volunteering your time to come here and talk. I personally really appreciate it as well.
Yeah, you're welcome.